Stjernholm Reviews. Making hi-fi great again and saving the wildlife habitats of the world. Join our Patreon and take part while enjoying all our exclusive listening session, early releases, and much, much more. Stjernholm Reviews. Your sound, your music, your planet.
I have always been into hi-fi for as long as I can remember, basically. Remember when I was like 10 years old, I started like purchasing speakers and components, and it was sort of a better, more golden time back then, I guess. I was in a small town, but they still had a hi-fi store, right? Where you could buy speakers and everything. And I also had an uncle who were like a do-it-yourself kind of guy who built speakers. And that was very intriguing to me. And my parents had a pair of his speakers, which I inherited later. So
okay, some that your uncle built?
Yeah, so I sort of got to inspect that. So that was where it started, I guess.
At what point did you say, heck, I'm going to start my own?
I've been into hi-fi all my life, so I had a lot of expensive, cool gear. But then you get kids and they're like these little creatures that can tip things over. So I got into a bit cheaper stuff and like wall-mounted, and that sort of killed like the fun of it. So I got to thinking, especially maybe on the bass. I always loved bass. So like, okay, how can I still have good bass, but like this tiny wall-mounted speakers? And also you don't want it to like be super visible, right? So the idea was born for the Incognito subwoofer, which is a bit of a strange sort of pizza box shape, I guess, that you can put on the floor, you can put it against the wall or even on the wall. I ended up prototyping that and hid it behind my TV on the wall. And that was a pretty awesome thing, really.
So the company jumped out of a true need.
Basically, to cover my own, I couldn't find a product like that was sort of a design, flexible placement type of thing, but still really high-end with regards to sound and capacity.
Okay, so that was your first product.
Even at first, I built it with an idea to be able to commercialize it, but prototype that I tested myself first.
And then what happened product-wise?
The SBS speaker was born, which is, no one understands that, but it's short for small, big speaker, because it really has the capacity of a floor standard, but it's really, really small. And it looks like a two-way bookshelf, but it's a coaxial driver and a mid-bass driver, so it's a 2.5 or really three-way system.
Yeah.
And four-way when you add the sub. So you have a really small system visually that is actually a quite large full-range system. That's four-way and 12-inch drivers in the bass and everything.
What are the benefits of doing active speakers, and why do you insist on doing active speakers?
There's several reasons. One is that I have a sort of a background from software and IT myself, so I really like the idea of having digital crossovers. It makes, from my perspective, it's great for the development process. It's much faster. You can do more precise stuff. There's less sort of efficiency loss, all of those things. And from the sort of consumer side, you get amplifiers dedicated to each channel, and they're sort of purpose-built to be perfect for that speaker. So it's sort of bound to get better. There's no sort of doubt about it, that it will be a better speaker.
So what would you say to those audiophiles that believe you need to have a big amp stack and a lot of gear besides the speakers?
I have great respect for the hobby, right? And for a lot of people, that's a great part of the hobby, to sort of explore new gear and switch it out now and then. So I fully understand that and respect that. And then when you think about it, you can think of the speakers as with built-in mono amplifiers, right? So the power amplifier is really the only thing you sort of have to get rid of. And you can still have tube preamps, you can have all kinds of sources and DACs and vinyl rigs, and you can still have a lot of things to sort of nerd about if you want to do that.
So the amplifiers used in your systems, are they the same type, or are you dedicated to a certain technology?
Yeah, so we use Hypex as the supplier for the amplifiers. Yeah. So they're basically world-class D amplifiers, and also really high-quality DSP and high-quality AKM DACs. It's preferred choice for sure.
How do you approach your development?
From my sort of decide to make an idea a reality until it's actually a commercial product that you can buy, it's anywhere from 18 to 24 months have been so far as well, at least. And I start with some drawings of sort of the physical product, simulations, trying to figure out what the drivers to use, things like that. And of course, before that, it's sort of ideation, trying to look at what product makes sense to build, of course, as well. Everything we do is unique in some perspective, so I try to find... So we're a new brand, right? So it's a very conservative market. So I try to find products that are niche in some way or other, so you can't buy sort of exactly that somewhere else. So to like put another passive bookshelf speaker to the world is like just not interesting to me. I want to do something that's a bit unique. And quite quickly I go into prototyping, that I basically build myself. Then you can quite quickly get to something quite good because it's digital, right? You have the active speakers, you can program the crossovers and everything like that. And experiment quite a bit. And then we do a more refined prototype that sort of looks better to like experiment with the visual design. So I have used some Norwegian, there's a couple of different guys like that cater mostly to do-it-yourself people that can do really high-end like prototypes. So we've been doing that, and I also get samples from the manufacturer that do the actual cabinets to see that they get it right. And also I've been on forums, so I'm quite open during that development process, so I share along the way. Sometimes the sort of initial idea doesn't pan out or it changes along the way. This speaker, for instance, had the bass drivers in the front to begin with, and he actually had the different coaxial drivers also in the first prototypes. So there's always some critics there or some that are skeptic, and then I at least get to think about that idea. So does that have merit or not?
Tuning work. How do you go about doing that?
The combined sound from a speaker, the dispersion characteristic, how it integrates with the room and all of that, it becomes a pretty complicated equation. So of course you want a relatively flat speaker to begin with, but then you have to work from there, basically listening to thousands of tracks across all genres to see how it works. Even though the on-axis response looks flat, there are things that make some things stand out in the room. So it's trying to get sort of the perfect compromise out of that by listening to a lot of stuff. I don't want the speaker to sound harsh. I don't want it to be fatiguing over time. But then you have to hit that balance and also not make it sort of dull or like remove the resolution and detail. I want to sort of combine detail with pleasant sound.
Yeah, so the tuning is much more than just dialing in a frequency response.
Yeah, and there's some of the most difficult areas there is sort of the lower mid-range or the mid-bass from like 100 hertz to 500-600 hertz often interacts sort of in a bad way with the room. You get dips and things. That's one of the reasons we use like this and the Manta have these splits on the side. So there's a cardioid pattern on these speakers down to around 100 hertz. You get a lot of direct sound in front of you, but most traditional speakers also have a lot of sound wrapping around, hitting sidewalls, hitting the rear walls, creating reflections. No driver is perfect, so those reflections aren't like a perfect reflection of the direct sound. So that ends up muddying the sound, and if you have a very reflective room, you get a lot of sort of destructive reflections. So that's reduced in this setup because you get sound out of phase from behind the driver through the ports that sort of attenuates the side and rear sound basically. So you get less reflections and easier integration even in normal rooms.
Mr. Wizard, one thing I noticed with these speakers that I'm not used to is these speakers are capable of being pushed up against the wall like pretty close.
So they're designed to be close to the wall and still have pretty tight bass, and you also have like a button here to tilt the bass a bit so that you can easily fine-tune it even more. And I also try with all our speakers to achieve like a quite large sound stage also and the depth and everything despite being close to the wall.
I would love to know what kind of sound profile are you designing for?
I think the soundstage, a large, wide, like almost larger than life soundstage, I like that. And still have precise imaging. So the coaxial drivers helps a lot with that. I want good detail, good resolution. I do not want harshness. I don't want it to sound hard even when I listen to sort of my 90s rock or something like that. And that also means you need good like punch in the mid bass, you need sufficient low end so that even things that are a bit thin, like produced, still sounds okay and at least not harsh. And there's different schools, I guess, but then you'd say, okay, these speakers are warm, and I think many people would probably say that. I'm sort of of the opinion that they're really neutral, but it's been sort of a hi-fi myth or something that we ended up thinking what we call neutral is really on the cold side. So we have to sort of redefine that. And I think if you go to an unamplified concert of almost any type of instrument, it's not really harsh or hard. It's quite warm and full of sounding, right? They sound rich, warm, and natural, I would call it. I think I've achieved sort of a interesting balance where, like the old Goldies, they sound good, not too hard, and still very modern stuff doesn't sound too heavy either. In terms of dynamics, that's another thing I'm striving for. It's quite high dynamic and good headroom. These speakers are sort of deviating from my initial philosophy, actually, because the previous two systems are four-way systems, and you can basically daisy chain subs if you want to like keep increasing the headroom. So there's a lot of capacity there, and there's a lot of capacity in these guys as well. But yeah, you should be able to play basically as loud as you want in the space you have. That's the goal. So you can't do that with any combination of our systems, but you can definitely configure a system from us that I think you could turn up as loud as you want.
How did it get its name, by the way?
Yeah, so Ranna was actually a combination of my grandmother on my like mother and father side. There's Anna and Sara. And the reason I did that was because I started doing that on the Manta, because that's a strange story as well. But my uncle, who was the like do-it-yourself guy that I was inspired from, he had an Opel Manta in the 80s. So that's where that name come from. So it's a sort of an Easter egg in the name.